As we focus on understanding data, we're going to go back to some things that we talked about in section 3 of this module. There we talked about classifying and sorting objects, and that is a real nice natural transition into data interpretation. So here I have heavy objects and light objects, and then maybe I could use that information to create some type of graph. How many heavy objects do we have? How many light objects do we have? I could also think about measuring things. So we've talked about that earlier in this module. And then I could use data that comes from taking different measurements to then think about how could I represent this data. Maybe I could show how many rocks are 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inches in length. Or maybe here I could make a bar graph to show how many rocks are 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, or 4 inches in length. Now, as we get to thinking about the data with the bar graphs, one of the nice things you can do here, and probably you're already doing this already, is to ask students about some of their favorite things, maybe favorite foods or favorite shows or favorite activities, and then you can create a bar graph that reflects the students in your classroom. So for example, maybe I asked students what was their favorite thing to measure with, and some students said scale, some students said tape measure, a lot of students said thermometer, and some students said ruler. So there then I could show the number of students that voted for each of these ways to measure things. I can also show data with line plots. Here we can do any type of measurement and represent that on the line plot. So here I have a line plot. Maybe I measured things according to length, and then I see, well, how many things were 4 inches? Well, one thing. How many things measured 6 inches? 4 of them. How many things measured 8 inches? 3. And then how many things measured 10 inches? Only 2 of them. So that is how a line plot can be used to represent data as well. We want to talk with students often about the scales that we use on these graphs. This is important for pretty much anything we do with data interpretation. So here, if I'm talking about the scale here, each of these represents the inches, and then each of this information represents the counts of the objects that were represented by those inches. Now, some key considerations that you want to consider here as we get into creating graphs with our students. First, we want to show the same data using different methods. So could I use like a pie graph? Could I use a pictograph? Could I use a bar graph? And could I use a line plot or line graph, as we saw, to represent the same data, but represent it in different ways? As we look at these different types of graphs and charts, it's really important to talk a lot about them. What do they mean? How do we interpret that? And then we have to engage students in practice. As we've talked about all through the Kansas Math Project, practice is how students learn math. So lots of different practice problems, even more than several, I will say, will help students understand what this data represents. And then we also want to think about, well, what's the best format? Maybe we practiced putting data into a pictograph, a bar graph, and a line plot, but now which of those actually makes the most sense to use? It doesn't always make sense to use a bar graph. Maybe a pictograph is better, or maybe it doesn't always make sense to use a pictograph. Maybe a line graph or line plot is better. So lots of different ways that you can help students talk through the keys and the essentials to data interpretation. That brings us to activity 7, where you are going to think about some of the activities you use to help students with data interpretation. Jot a few of those ideas down, and you might use one of those ideas for what's upcoming, which is using our CLEAR model to explore data interpretation.